Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Powerful Women Rising podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Snow. I am a former dating coach for women turned business relationship strategist. For the last 3 years, I have been helping female entrepreneurs grow their business through networking like a human and not like a salesy weirdo. So my company, Powerful Women Rising, is focused on changing the face of networking. We are all about authenticity and integrity and making networking fun again. Most people, when they think about networking, think about business cards, transactional relationships, small talk, all the things that nightmares are made of. And I love teaching people how to network in a different way, a way that actually feels good to you, but also gets you results. And I run an online community for female entrepreneurs called the Powerful Women Rising Community. It is a mix of networking and mastermind calls and some business strategy and mindset coaching thrown in. It is designed to be everything that you need to start, grow, scale a business all in one place. Amazing resources, amazing women, so much brilliance on those calls, and I would love for you to be a part of it. So if that sounds of interest to you, definitely click on the show notes and check it out. All right, today's episode is all about podcasts, ironically enough. How meta are we that we have a podcast about podcasts? I know, it's next level. This is a great interview. People ask me all the time, do you listen to your interviews after you do them? The answer is yes, partly because sometimes I've done the interview weeks, even months before it is live, and sometimes months before I record this intro. So I have to remind myself, like, wait, what were we talking about? I just listened to this podcast episode for the third time, actually, and it's just as good the third time, maybe even better. This is an interview that I did with Xavier, and she is a multilingual, award-winning podcast marketer with 10 plus years of experience producing podcasts in the UK, in the US, and in Portugal. She also has her own show, The Podcast Space, where she provides strategic but practical ways for professionals to use their show as an effective tool for online marketing. So we cover a wide array of topics as they relate to podcasts. So this is a great episode for you if you have a podcast, if you have considered having a podcast, or if you're just open to the idea of growing your business by being a guest on other people's podcasts. This is something that I've done a lot, both in my dating coaching business and in my business with Powerful Women Rising, both guesting on other podcasts and then also ultimately hosting my own podcast. There is a lot to be learned from both. And if you're not quite ready to take the leap to having your own podcast, there is a lot of power in being a guest on other people's podcasts. It increases your visibility, but it's also really good for your self-concept. This is one of the things that we talk about, really being able to see yourself as an expert, as an authority, and it does a lot of really good things for your mindset. So regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of podcasting, this is a great interview for you to listen to and spark some new ideas for you. As always, we will be chatting more about this topic over on Instagram. So if you're not following me, be sure to go check out at Powerful Women Rising and let's keep chatting. I would love to hear your thoughts on this podcast. If you got any new ideas or insights, I know that you're going to love it because Anna is amazing. All right, here we go. Good morning, Anna. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Yes, I'm super excited to chat with you. Before we get started, go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about you and about what you do.
Yes. So I'm a multilingual marketing professional. So I help primarily small business owners who are female, multilingual, and who really want to make an impact in the world. So I help them figure out what is the type of content strategy they need to have in order to get to their goals. So from the idea of the content itself to all the way to the promotion of that podcast and how to just basically connect with their listeners in a way that feels fun and authentic.
I love that. How did you get involved in the podcast space?
So, the podcast space.
I know you like that.
That's a whole story for another question. But I actually, when I studied journalism back in Portugal, where I'm originally from, back in 2008, we didn't have a traditional radio station. So we had a hybrid of kind of like internet radio and podcasting. So we actually had to create mini features. So we had to write titles, show notes, and then have like the audio file that would go on an RSS feed. So I normally say technology was a bit different, but back in 2008, I was already doing it. And when I moved into the UK, I was involved in a lot of online radio and a lot of really cool initiatives with local councils and museums and stuff. And so we did a show that was online, but also as a podcast version. So I always talk about how like there's so many things that changed in podcasting in the last 20 years and so people have no idea how easy it is to do podcasting today with all the cool tools that is just like tap tap tap, done done done, let's go. Especially with AI today, I'm like, I sound like an old lady. I'm only 35, but I go, back in my day those things were very different, because they were. So that's how I got involved, and primarily working with small business and especially minorities and multilinguals is just a passion of mine, because I am an immigrant. I am a multilingual. I am a female entrepreneur who struggles with a lot of imposter syndrome. So I really have a heart for amazing women who are, look at me, like putting myself in that category. So really helping them figure out what is their zone of genius, coaching them through what feels authentic, and really shine as an authority, because as women, I feel like we hold back a lot. And so to me, I've worked with so many people from all around the world, but I primarily love working with these communities because it's just so fulfilling to see the beginning and the end of where they are. So definitely for me, it's like, if I have a preference, that's the kind of client I want to serve, because it's just amazing.
That's awesome. So do you work mostly with women who want to start podcasts, or women who already have podcasts that they want to optimize, or do you do both?
So I primarily work with women who have done, or multilinguals and minorities who have already started a podcast, because the success rate of podcasting is actually very low. Only 45% of people who start a podcast make it to episode 8, sorry. Wow. And only 10% make it to 50 episodes. So if you have a weekly show, only 10% of people who start make it through that first year of podcasting, which when you look at statistics is insane, right? So I like working with people who have done it by themselves, who maybe DIY'd it, or maybe they hired out and they say, hey, for instance, I had a client who did her first year of podcasting. She's like, I just want to figure this out. And then after a year, she was like, you know what? I'm ready to actually work with someone who's going to teach me, like, does this make sense? I'm really overwhelmed with this. Is there a better way? Or how do I use these podcasts to effectively get clients or become an authority or get more speaking gigs? So by doing that with podcasters who have done it for at least 3 to 6 months, they know what they've tried. They kind of like, no, they really want to do this. And so they're way more committed to working with me, which to me is like, okay, yes, like I'm here to serve you. But at the same time, I want to make sure that it makes sense. And as a small business owner, it's more strategic to work with people who are more aligned with what you want to do and the results, because anyone who launches a business, you want to have results to talk about it in your marketing. You got to put in my marketing hat. I'm like, if you're working with people who are not sure, it's going to be flip-flopping here, flip-flopping there, and you may never be able to actually say, hey, we had these results, or it worked because of this, or it may just not be a good fit for anyone. So that's why I prefer working with people who have started a podcast, have done it for a while, and then they're like, I don't know what I don't know, so teach me the ways. And I'm like, yes, let's go.
Yeah, I love that. So I run a community for female entrepreneurs online. And one of the things that we talk about frequently is like, you have to stick with something long enough to know if it's actually going to work. And that's really hard, especially when you're in that newer space of like, okay, but I need to make money yesterday. And right. We put this thing out in the world that we think is so great and everybody's going to want to buy it. And then they don't buy it the first time we market it. And then we're like, well, this is terrible. I need to go create a different thing. Right. So even just that, like, I'm always like, let's just do it for 90 days and see what happens, because you need at least that much time. And also depends what you're doing in those 90 days, right? We're not just going to like sit and wait for 90 days. That also will not work, it turns out. But I love what you said about, working with people who have been at it for a little while, because I think it's really easy in the entrepreneurial space. There's so many messages. And I want to talk to you about this, about like all the things that you should be doing to grow your business, right? You should have a podcast. You should have a Facebook group. You should be speaking. You should do this. You should have a blog. So in your opinion, who should start a podcast? And is there anybody who should not start a podcast?
Well, that's like almost, I wouldn't say the $1 million question, but it's really a really, really important question to ask yourself, especially as women. We tend to be very creative. And so we want to try things. And so the first thing that you want to determine is to actually determine your podcast goal. What would you do with this show? It's not just necessarily like, oh, I just want to do it. It's just like, what is the end goal, right? Because I normally talk about, there's about 7 different ways you can use a podcast. You can use it for content for your business. And I had clients who were like, Anna, I have empty page syndrome. I really hate writing, but I love having conversations. I love talking. So that was the avenue to get content for their website, their online presence and marketing, newsletters, all of the things. So if that's what you're struggling with and you love talking, a podcast makes sense, right? So because the results are more immediate, you immediately get content, right? Mm-hmm. So it's also like looking at the timeline of looking at those results. If you want sales, of course, those are not coming right away unless you come with a pre-built audience that already is interested in what you do. Networking is one of the almost 2 immediate ways to get to improve the quality of your network. I mean, a podcast is still considered, and me as a former journalist, like when you look at a high level, high quality, really relevant kind of like communication in terms of appearances online and all of that, like a podcast is considered like a radio show. It's considered as a media appearance. So basically, when you're looking at really improving the quality of your network, you can get a CEO, you can get a founder, you can get a VP. Nobody's going to send an intern to a podcast interview, right? So you're skipping the gatekeepers in order to get to that point. So, I mean, what a better way to get access to like high quality conversations and high quality people. So if you are in the middle of nowhere and you say, you know what, I really want to improve my network because I feel like I don't know anyone, you can do it. Something that has been really interesting is that actually a lot of people are using podcasts to change their career or their industry. So they improve the quality of their network, right? So if they want to apply for a different type of job and all that, like they have now the decision makers in their network, which is amazing. Or they get to discover things about a whole industry without having to work at it, right? Like, how amazing is that? You get so much knowledge with your own podcast. You'll learn so much about like different industries, right? So if you wanted to laser focus on one, you could. So lead generation is one that takes a little longer, and like lead generation and sales kind of go together. It's more of a long-term thing, and it really depends on the price of the product. If you have a book, if you have like kind of a low ticket item, it's easier to sell to an audience than, for instance, coaching programs, because not everyone, some people are listening to your show, the DIYers. Other people are listening in because they like really want to learn from you and they will want to buy from you. But like, it really depends what's the mindset of these audience, what's the industry like. You have to really think about all of that. And then another one is using that to just improve your authority online. So basically, even if you release an episode that is like 10 minutes long, but like talking for 10 minutes for one thing, like I'm talking probably by now, maybe 3 to 5 minutes on this. And it's going to be like a breath of knowledge that you're like, oh, wow, like that was a lot. So if you can talk consistently for 5 to 10 minutes on a topic, you are an expert. And people, there's these misconceptions, especially with women, that they have to do more. They have to do bigger. They have to do shinier things. And I'm like, no, like if I always say this, if a quote can inspire you and can change behaviors, why wouldn't a podcast that is like almost like a microcast, like why wouldn't you be able to change someone's day in 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Right. It's like, it's one of those things that when you compare a podcast episode with a quote, people go, yeah, like I have a favorite quote that guides my day. I had a favorite quote that changed completely the way that I was living my life. So we have to really rethink what becoming an authority and like showing up as an authority looks like. And so like a podcast can be a great way, and it can be just like something that is like, you can turn an Instagram live into a podcast. You can turn a LinkedIn live into a podcast. It's just allowing the format to meet the need of the audience. So if someone is driving, they can't be on, especially like the LinkedIn app, such a terrible user experience. So anyone who has tried join a live session is just a mess. So if you want to make sure that you're tapping into people who are driving, like it's just meeting them where they are. So those are just some of the ways. Like people do it for passion projects as well. And so for me, it's just like really assessing, what do you want this to be? And sometimes, again, you increase the intimacy of the person you're talking to through, conversations with guests, but also the conversation with a listener. So when I'm talking to people, I always share, when you're creating a podcast, this can be literally just your kind of like a tool for self-discovery, because you're talking in a way to nobody when you're doing a solo episode, right? So you're really discovering, like I started my podcast after having worked for years and launching the podcast space in 2020. I only launched the podcast last year in January of 2023, because I was like, I'm working with so many different things, so many different clients. I don't have the capacity. But once I launched the podcast, I was like, I really know my stuff, because you're like, oh, I'm behind the scenes, I'm creating content, but like not really live. Like I'm writing newsletters, I'm doing videos on Instagram. But when you do a podcast, you're like just a whole different level of confidence and just like self-development in a way that feels like you're marketing yourself, but also at the same time, you're actually at your own time, just boosting that confidence, boosting that knowledge, because you have to research sometimes. Like, I mean, for you probably have to like go in and on Google a few things, or just do a bit of like research on the person. You always get to learn a bit more. So it's almost like learning or hacking life at a higher speed, because you're just like, okay, every single episode, I got to learn something new. And as a journalist, I used to do that. Like, okay, I have to talk about this thing. So just learn about how to do this one thing in a very quick period of time. So same thing for most people. You're like a journalist.
Yeah, I relate to like everything that you just said. I feel like a podcast for me has been really helpful with content creation, because you can repurpose it in so many different ways, right? Like we will record this video and then it will become reels. I will take quotes from it and I will put them on like graphics. It can become so many different things. And then I can repeat that next year, right? Like I can pull out 3 new clips and now all of a sudden I have more content from this same interview that we did. I also loved what you said about how it is really helpful for your own personal growth, and not just positioning yourself as an expert in other people's eyes, but I feel like for me, it's really helped me like see myself as an expert in my own eyes. Because I don't know if you have this experience, but I've been doing what I do and teaching things about networking and creating business relationships for so long that it seems to me like just second nature. Like this is stuff everybody knows, right? And so then I will record a solo episode that is usually only like 10, 15 minutes long, because I'm like, this is a really long time to talk to myself. And I think like that was such like obvious information. And I will get so much feedback from people about those episodes. Like, that was so good. I'd never thought about it that way before. I loved what you said about this. And I'm like, oh, really? Well, thank you.
You're like,
not in like a, oh my gosh, I'm so awesome kind of way, but like, it reminds me that I do have expertise that a lot of other people don't have, that is valuable to them to share with them. And that's very motivating.
Yeah, and you just hit it in the nail, the nail in the head.
There you go.
Whatever. So you really hit it, because a lot of women we're so deep into the knowledge that we have to sometimes take a step back. And that's where I say, when you're starting a podcast, you have to determine a few things. Like, is this podcast for you, or is this podcast for your audience? Can it be for both? But like, again, you can just say, all I want is just for me. Like, I want to be a public speaker and I just want this to help me sift through ideas. It can be for a book, right? Like, so many different things, but I don't think enough people think about really the process, because as you sit down and think about like, okay, beginning, middle, end, what do they need to know? How can these episodes be self-contained? It takes a lot of time for you to think about, especially even if you have to think about it for 2 seconds, you have to think, okay, I don't have any more context. This is not part of a conversation. They need to start listening to this episode, finish the episode like, that made sense, right? Like I follow that. And it's so hard to explain things from a beginner's mindset or in a way that doesn't, like, if your podcast is not for people who are on your level and it's just a few steps behind, it's really hard sometimes because you have to remember to not default to the lingo, to the right? Because as an expert, you are like, you have so much knowledge about that one thing that you have to stop yourself and say, they don't need to know this. They don't need to know that yet, right? That can be for another episode. And that's also an exercise in like challenging yourself to, how can I talk to this in a way that feels relatable? Mm-hmm. And something that I didn't touch on my previous question that I'll just wrap it up quickly is that having a podcast may not make sense for people who actually have no time, because this podcast, like a podcast takes forever, right? Like to build an audience, to just edit, publish show notes, uses that like to actually market the podcast well. It takes a long time. So basically, if you are someone who is already very overwhelmed with your business, like maybe a podcast is not good for you, but you can guest on other people's podcasts. As I was talking about, the power is the same. So when you're looking at a podcast, if you're someone who struggles with breaking down ideas, you feel like you're really stressed out every time you have to sit down. If you feel like for instance, I don't like doing interviews actually as the host, because for some reason in my mind, I default to, I have to be a journalist. I have to know all about this topic. And I like just talking, right? And so to me, it feels really stressful. So I actually rarely do interviews. And so that can be something that if you feel super nauseous, if you feel like this stresses me out, being a guest is so much easier because you just sit down. Like I just sat down with you and I'm like, let's talk, Melissa. And so basically, that is one of the things that people have to think about. Like, could that be a self-developing tool, or is this actually being a lot of stress, bringing a lot of anxiety to your life? It may not make sense, right? Because you may be like, oh my gosh, like I feel flustered. I can't explain this. I just don't enjoy it. Or I can't talk to myself. I feel like so self-aware. So that's something that is very is very interesting, that sometimes happen as you are doing those solos. You're like, I hate the sound of my voice and I cannot get over myself. So that can happen too.
Yeah. And I think you have to think about what is your true intent with the podcast, and like, why are you really doing it? This is something I say about networking a lot too. It's like, if you're just doing it because someone somewhere told you needed to network to grow your business, please don't. And same with a podcast, right? If you just like, you read an article or you were scrolling or you listened to this episode or whatever, and you're like, oh, everybody who's succeeding as an entrepreneur has a podcast. I need a podcast. That is not a good reason to start a podcast, I think.
Yes. Oh my gosh. You were talking about networking, and like, I heard this thing in a conference that I think is so interesting that I never looked at it in that perspective. And I'm very curious. I know, like, again, you can use the podcast to network as well, right? But when you're going to a networking event, sometimes we feel like, again, because we're expected, and same thing with the podcasting, you're expected to go at it and have be the light that is in the room and everybody gets attracted to you. And like, not everyone is that. Like, I am an extrovert. I am lucky that I'm like, okay, I can go to a room and like pretty much talk to anyone.
Yeah.
But someone else in a conference said, if you struggle with networking, think about it's not about you. Like, you can be the person that helps someone else who is like just having a terrible time, like connecting to other people. You can be their like buddy and like light them up. And it's the same thing with podcast guesting in a way. You can be someone else's like support. They need a guest. You can fill that void. But like in your on your end, like, how is it when someone goes, I hate networking? Like, it's the same thing for you, right? Like, you have to look at like, why do you want to do this? And your personality too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was a dating coach for 6 years before this. And one of the things I used to always tell my clients is like, if you're going into a date with this mindset of like, I don't want to be going on this date, I went on 12 dates. They've all been terrible. This one's going to be terrible too. Like, if you knew the person you were going on a date with was going in thinking that, like, would you want to go on that date? Because
Such a
I
good
wouldn't.
point.
And it was the same thing with networking, right? Like, if you're walking into a room like, gosh, I don't want to be here. I hate networking so much. Like, you are creating your own destiny. And if you were forcing yourself to start a podcast because you think that's the thing that you have to do and that's what everybody else is doing, you're going to show up to record an episode, whether it's a solo episode or an interview episode, like, God, I don't want to do this. Right. And
Yeah.
like, I don't want to listen to somebody who's like, I don't want to be here. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Like your role is to be magnetic to the topic or to your world, right? And when we do something that we love, and this is where like I'm like, I want to work with people who are like, I'm not enjoying this podcast anymore. And normally we look at the format because normally that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
They think they have to, and like air quotes, bigger quotes, like they have to, because they look around and they go, oh, all the big podcasters are doing this or this format. I'm like, do you have a big team? They're like, no, it's just me, myself, and I, or me and an editor. I'm like, okay, do you have a team of researchers? And they go, no. And I'm like, that's what these big shows have. Do you have maybe 8+ years of podcasting? No. There you go. Like, so let's bring down the expectations of what we have of what podcasting should look like. And let's create a plan that helps you create and generate ideas and generate episodes that feel exciting to you, which in turn will get the audience excited. And it's just like people go, wait, what? It's like giving you like permission to really do this thing in a way that it's fun for you. Because if there's no fun, and fun, like it doesn't have to be like, fun. It can be like enjoyable.
Yeah.
Like if you're not enjoying the process, because a podcast is a marathon, like it's gonna suck. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're not gonna see results because you're fighting every step of the way. Like, I hate this. I'm not getting listeners. I'm not getting enough downloads. I'm not getting like messages, right? Because that's the energy you're putting out. And so I just want to challenge people to think about like, what have you been doing that feels out of alignment, that feels like just not exciting at all? So that's the first thing, like to allow ourselves to ask ourselves, like, what do I want this to be? And to be disruptors and to be rebels and say, no one else is doing this, so I am trying it.
Yeah. And to not assume that your topic is uninteresting or that there's not people out there like this is not relatable to enough people. I can't remember where I heard it. There was a story I heard about a woman who started a podcast and she was like really, really into bird watching. It wasn't her profession, but she lived in a certain part of the country where there were like birds there that weren't found anywhere else in the country. And I'm totally messing this story up. I'm making up most of it, but the premise is true. And so she started a podcast, even though she thought like, I'm the only person in the world who gives a shit about these birds. And it became so popular and she became like so popular on social media. And it was like this whole big thing because although it wasn't something that like the whole world was interested in, there were a lot of people who were interested in that one thing and they all found her podcast. So I think that's important too, is like, you don't have to have a topic that is applicable to everyone. Like people say all the time in marketing, if you're talking to everyone, you're not talking to anybody. And don't assume that the thing that you think is really interesting, that you're really passionate about, that you want to create a podcast and show up and talk about every week or every 2 weeks or every month. Like there are people out there in the world who think that is equally as interesting as you do and who are just as passionate as you are, and they will find your podcast.
100%. That is so true, especially with podcasting. People don't go on podcast apps and go, who should I listen to from these strangers? But they would go, for instance, on YouTube and type, bird watching. Mm-hmm. They come across your content. So you also have to think about like, when you're creating content, like as a small business owner, like you see a need, you fill the void. Or like just because someone else has the same business, you don't go, well, I can't start a business because there's people already doing business in that industry. Like, so it's the same with podcasting, right? It's just looking at the intersections that you're excited about. And yeah, sure, maybe some industries, some topics, some intersection are not going to be incredibly popular, but maybe having 100, like Clear example. One of my coaching clients, she has a podcast about global health. So it's not necessarily a very like generic topic. It's not about like entrepreneurship, but she is able, like she has $150 in recurring donations every single month from listeners. And her podcast only has about like 600 downloads per month. So you can actually monetize a very small audience, and you can have, and like, for instance, stuff that I like. That's why I love podcasts. Like, she interviewed a nonprofit that did some work in El Salvador, I believe. And so she interviewed them. They talked about the work they do. They talked about their need of volunteers, blah, blah, blah. Months later, she has someone who applied for a volunteer position. Like, she's a doctor looking for an opportunity to do volunteer work in El Salvador. She has contacts on the ground, and the way she got to them was because of the podcast.
That's awesome.
Like, how crazy. My client sent me that, and we started both crying. It was like, this is the stuff that dreams are made of. Like, you see the impact of your show with such a small show, and you can have such an amazing, like, kind of like story for your life. You're like, wow, like I made that happen. Like, kids are now being treated by a doctor that would have never known about that organization had she not listened to that podcast. Like, how amazing is that? So, thinking about also the impact that you get to do, like, we're all just human, especially if you work from home. Like, we have the internet. Like, you don't have to go door to door. You can have an impact worldwide with your content, even if it's not really, really big. So I always talk about like concrete examples, because people go, oh yeah, I heard someone like monetizing the podcast or having like great stories, but like, are they really out there? Yes. Right. So if it interests you, it will change the world somehow, or it can change just your world, and do it for yourself because you're happy. Like, same thing when sometimes people go, I've been wanting to write a book. And we all know that person. Like, for me, that's my husband. I want to write a book. I want to write a book. And I'm going to be writing my book this summer. And I'm going to be like, I'm going to write a book before you do, because you just keep saying, I want to write a book, right? It's the same thing for people who've been thinking about creating a podcast. Just do it for the craft, or just do it for the sake of saying, like, in terms of like bucket list or personal achievements, you can write your own book. And even if it's just like, an ebook or whatever, if it's just a podcast, just do it because you want to say, I did it because I felt like it, right? It doesn't need to be strategic even, but the opportunities that come out of it, those are the things that are really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to have a lot of drama about how many, I'm saying this for myself as well as everyone listening. You don't have to have a lot of drama about how many times your podcast is getting downloaded, who's listening to it, how many reviews are getting left. I mean, all of those things are great, right? I check mine all the time, and I have plenty of drama on my own, but I also have to remind myself sometimes, like, if one person listened to that whole podcast, or 5 people or 10 people, that's 10 people who thought what you were saying was interesting enough and valuable enough that they wanted to give their 20, 30 precious minutes to listening to. Like, that's not a small feat. Like, yeah, it's great if 5,000 people are listening to it, but also, like, don't discount the fact that you have something interesting enough to say that 10 people, who may be random people, right? It's not necessarily like your mom and all your cousins. Maybe 10 random people are like, I want to hear what this lady has to say. That's a big deal.
Yes. And I raise you with another thing. If you hate sales calls, your podcast can literally be the thing that warms up leads to work with you without you having, like, you're literally sleeping, you're getting downloads. You're going for a walk, you're getting downloads. You're like gardening, like sometimes I am, and I'm like, woohoo, I have 3 downloads. And so in my mind, I'm like, I'm doing my life. This is on autopilot for me. And to me, it's like, it's also my legacy. I don't work with beginner podcasters or people who want to start a podcast. So to me, it's like, hey, listen to this. This is my gift to you. And you're so right. Like, when people, like, it's a big commitment for someone to listen to you. They don't owe you anything. Listeners don't owe you anything. And so there's these disconnection between what people think. Like, people go, I want to have thousands of downloads. I want to have thousands of listeners. And I go, how many millionaires do you know? Right? Why do we think that we have to be millionaires in terms of downloads when we don't, like in terms of business, like we may not be making millions. We may not know anyone personally who is making millions. So why do we expect that to be the default?
Right.
And by the way, so many people lie about downloads. Recently, Apple Podcasts released this new iOS update, which basically tells your phone, if you haven't listened to a podcast that you subscribed to forever ago, and you haven't listened to the latest 5 episodes, the podcast will stop being auto-downloaded to your phone. So a lot of people, myself included, because a big community that I have is like based in the US, I have like secondary, like about like 40% is from listening on Spotify, but I saw like about a 15% decrease because of all these people that subscribe to my show maybe in January of 2023. Like my husband, my husband is getting so much shout out in this episode. But the reality is people subscribe to your show. Maybe they lose interest. Maybe they kind of like graduate, air quotes again, from your content, and maybe they're not there anymore, right? Or maybe they wanted to start whatever the business they did. They were like, okay, this is cool. I lost interest. Or maybe there are people who life got in the way and then they're like, oh, I want to go back to it. So, right, like it can happen. So these people were counted as downloads, as unique listeners, depending on whatever numbers and stats you're looking at. And I just tell clients, this is actually better because these are not inflated numbers. You know that this is more accurate than ever before.
Right.
So a lot of people apparently who are like the really big shows lost really high positions they had in the charts because like 20% of their downloads, 35%, 40% were just people who subscribe to the show would never listen.
Yeah.
So to all these people that are like, oh, my podcast is down, my downloads are down, it's fine. It's better in the long run. It's more accurate, and you'll be able to tell, okay, 30 people actually care about the show instead of 100 and thinking, why am I not getting any emails about inquiries about my business or whatever it is? So it's a good thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you mentioned earlier that if someone didn't want to start a podcast or didn't feel like now was the right time for them, that guesting on podcasts was a good alternative. Can you talk a little bit about why being a guest on someone else's podcast is valuable and maybe like how to get started doing that?
Yes. So basically, if you have a podcast or you have a podcast in seasons, or you just don't want to launch your own, guesting on other people's podcasts is, I would say, it's not as effective because you don't have all the control of the conversation, right, and the topic, but you get to practice your thought leadership as well, right? Mm-hmm. Someone else is doing the work. Someone else is paying for an editor. Someone else is giving you content to market to your own podcast. And even there's people that all they do is just saying, hey, could you send me the interview file, because then I can cut it up for my own social media. So all they do is just being on other people's podcasts, but you're tapping into someone else's audience for free organically, right? Mm-hmm. Another point that is like super important is that organic search terms start popping up on Google. Your name starts showing up without you having to spend a dime on SEO, on search engine optimization. So you don't have there's all of these pointers in all of these places talking about you and your expertise. Again, you can't just go on podcasts and talk about like all the different things that you could be talking about. Like you have to pick like the topic. Like I sometimes get invited to talk about like how to, because I'm an immigrant, people say, hey, I really find your story inspiring. And I'm like, sure, can we talk about like maybe like the profession and stuff so we can weave in that naturally in the conversation? Yeah. Also, podcast listeners will be podcast listeners, both for you and your show. So if you have a podcast, it's easier to convert a podcast listener from another show to yours than a social media follower into a listener. Because people, sometimes I have people who in my, like, I think that I do a good job at promoting podcasts in a different way than other than go and listen to the podcast. And I have so many people who say, I find your content so valuable. And it was 3 months into me launching the podcast and they say, I still haven't listened to your show. And I'm like, that's fine. All I want, again, the podcast for me is a tool for my business. So I do a lot of stuff in depth to help my clients listen to stuff in their own time. It's for lead generation, but also for I get hired a lot by other agencies to help help the clients that they're working with, or maybe even finding themselves like, we don't know really how to market ourselves in the podcast world. Like, can you help us? Like, how do we market better our content? I'm like, sure. So I really use the podcast in a few different ways. So my social media is exclusively to build rapport with the audiences and to just help them. If it takes them 3 months to get to my podcast, it takes them 3 months, but it takes them 3 months. I had interviews where someone listened to an interview I did. They immediately came into my social media. They binged my content and I was like, yay. And so they became podcast listeners because the person already had built into their habits being a listener.
Yeah.
So that's why it's easier to do that transfer to podcasts. And again, like, this is such an underused technique. Like, you can guest on other people's podcasts and then have the episode and use it for your own feed and say, hey, I was interviewed on this show. I don't get to talk about my story as frequently as I should. Here's the show, by the way. Go and check out the host, right? So you can actually do a lot of things when you're guesting, even if you have your own podcast and even if you don't, because you can say, just the preparation stresses me out. Then like, sit down and be a guest. That's such a great way. I think I answered most of your question, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm like,
No, you did. Do you have any like tips or secrets that would help people find podcasts to be guests on?
Yes, there's an app called Pod Pros. It's a platform for podcast guesting, but really just go onto Apple Podcasts. And again, don't pitch really big shows. That's like, obviously, like, if you're not a person who has a big presence, it may be harder to get on those shows. So first, go on social media and say, hey, I would love to guest on podcasts. Does any of you have podcasts that I should guest on? Like, you'd be surprised about the amount of people who is in your community and say, hey, I have a podcast, or hey, I listened to these podcasts. That is great. I think you would be a great guest. So put the work on them in a way. Yeah. Because they know you, right? Like, your community knows you. Another one is, but beyond these platforms, honestly, like LinkedIn, just go through the keywords of the things they want to be a part of. So for instance, like for me, I primarily work with female entrepreneurs and multilinguals. So that's the type of show I search for. People who are very intentional with their time, who want to make an impact in the world. So entrepreneurship, marketing, podcasts. So sometimes not guesting on podcasts about podcasting is actually important, because you're kind of almost like cannibalizing the same topic. So sometimes going into slightly like, I'm doing this on your show, right? Like, we have a lot of overlap. I'm helping your community learn a bit more about maybe something that's been missing from their strategy, or like that actually they want to start a podcast or guest. And at the same time, there's a lot of alignment in the purpose of what I'm doing. Like, don't just go on any podcast. Like, and sometimes the pitches I get are like, oh yeah, this person who's like 19. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, sure, I'm not saying this person is an inspiration. They may not have like a very interesting story, but like, my podcast is about using the podcast as a marketing tool. Like, what?
Yeah.
Right. So when you're thinking about it, go to, honestly, sometimes asking if you have guests on your show, ask them, hey, who should I look out for, right? Like, anyone I should be guesting on, anyone I should be having on the podcast. And that's a great way to tap into other people's networks, just literally tagging people, asking people around. But if you're just like, I just want a list, listen notes is another great tool. Not only it shows you the shows that there are in several categories, but it actually shows you the quality of the show. So they have like the kind of like the listener
score.
Yes, thank you. And the global rank. So for instance, my podcast ranks on the top 5%. And you think, oh, wow, like I only have like 300 to 400 downloads per month. So that's not a lot, but the quality of the consumption of each episode, I get a lot of new followers all the time, subscribers. So that means it's a healthy podcast. Also, I release weekly. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. But again, if you want to look at a show that is at least on the 20-25%, and I would look at like, have they released an episode? Are they accepting guests? I hate when I I hear from clients like, oh my gosh, my podcast is solo and I get pitched all the time. Like, take a minute to look at the podcast. If there's no names there, this is not a podcast that accepts guests. I'm not going to make an exception for you.
Right.
So I think that would be like super important. Like, actually do your homework.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a question on my podcast guest application that's like, tell me about an episode that you listened to and what you thought about it or something like that. Just because like, I'm always surprised by people who will apply to be on the podcast that they've never even listened to it. And I'm like, you don't even know if we're aligned. Like, you don't even know what I'm talking about. You don't know if my style fits with your style. Like, there are times that I'm like, oh, I should be on this podcast. And then I listen to it and I'm like, no, I should not be. Right?
Yes. It's a PR risk, actually, especially if you guest on a podcast that like has the opposite idea. And again, you can like debate. There are some shows that are about debating, but like when the whole core of the show goes against the values of what you stand for, what your business stands for. Yeah, maybe not. But yeah, your form is in a perfect example. Is like, if you really care, you will fill it out. If you don't, if you're like being lazy, you also don't have to bother with that person. So that's a great example of like how to filter and sift through people who may not be a good fit.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such good information. Thank you so much. I love it when I have guests that come and share like actual useful information.
Yeah, it's not gatekeeping.
Yeah. Or like, well, there's really great ways to do that. And I would love to tell you what they are if you go to my website.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Or like download and like the user path is like, give me your email. And after an email sequence of 5 emails and 2 trainings, you can get in. It's just like super generic advice. Oh my God. Yeah. It drives me bananas.
Yeah. So if people want to connect with you further and learn more about what you do, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yes. So first off, subscribe to the podcast, The Podcast Space, on any podcast platform as well as LinkedIn. That's the name I use on Instagram, and by the way, and Xavier on LinkedIn. But honestly, like, let's be honest, like, Instagram really is the most fun place, like, to hang out and to connect with people. I'm as relaxed as I am right now in this interview on my social media. So come and, like, I always share a lot of behind the scenes. So come and join me, because on the stories, I'm always talking about like different things that most people don't talk about. So you should definitely check me out there. And if you want help with your podcast, whether that's through coaching, instant access courses, there you go, or consulting. I do 1-hour consulting as well. Check them out at thepodcastspace.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Powerful Women Rising podcast. It's been over a year that I've been doing this podcast, and I have had so much fun hanging out with you guys every single week. The experts that I've gotten to bring you and the interviews that I've gotten to share have been so amazing. They truly have blown my mind. And the feedback that I've gotten on the solo episodes has been amazing as well. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to follow this podcast and to hang out with me every week. I would love to continue the conversation with you over on Instagram, so definitely join me there. And if you like what you hear in this podcast, I would love it if you would leave a review. You can do it on Apple, or you can go over to our YouTube channel and leave a review there. All right, everybody, I will see you next week.